Ladies and gentlemen, I'm welcoming you in one more Fireside. We're here at Delphi Forum. I'm Apostolos Mangiriadis. I'm a political correspondent with SKAI Television, and I'm very glad to introduce you Nathalie Tocci, who is the director of Istituto Affari Internazionali in Italy. Hello to Greece and Delphi.
Very nice to be here.
Thank you, Nathalie. And of course, again, Professor Manuel Trajtenberg, who is the executive director of VII in Israel. And we had our talk a couple of hours ago. We will continue this talk, accompanied by Nathalie, whom I will start our discussion if you allow us.
Sure.
I would like to ask you, Nathalie, how is the war in Ukraine changing priorities in our neighborhood? In countries in the Eastern Mediterranean, we talk a lot about the issue. We kind of sense that it's a spark plug for change. And it's a spark plug, as Professor Trajtenberg said a couple of hours ago, so that we see the bigger picture and it offers much more clarity. Do you agree with that or not?
Well, I think the sort of place to start is to really underline just how big a change we're talking about in general. I mean, you know, essentially this is the shift of a paradigm from a post-war era to a pre-war era. Now, a pre-war era does not necessarily, and hopefully it will not, end up in a war meaning a world war, but by definition, given that it's pre. But this is the, in a sense, the nature of the paradigmatic change that we're, I think, living through. So I think inevitably, you know, whatever region we're talking about, East Med, North Africa, Middle East, inevitably the repercussions are and will be huge. And we're only really kind of beginning to sketch some of the contours of this. So I think, you know, sort of one first, and then I'll come and sort of zoom in a little bit on the East Med side of it. But I think one of the big implications of all this, and I'd love to hear Manuel's thoughts on this as well, is the way in which countries in the region are positioning themselves in kind of rather different way, and in ways that in many respects cut across what appear to be many of the divisions or alliances and cleavages of the recent past. You know, this is, you know, to sort of make the sort of first obvious point, given that we're here in Greece, this is a time of major consolidation of NATO. And this obviously has an impact on relations between Greece and Turkey. It has had an impact...
Is that a positive impact, you think?
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, I don't, you know, I don't obviously claim that the problems...
They disappear,
no,
of course.
Absolutely not. But I think the context has changed in a way which makes... you know, because there's a, let me put it this way, there's a higher order paradigmatic shift in place, it just necessarily creates a different set of conditions for Greece and Turkey to interact. And also other countries with which Turkey, for instance, had very tense relationships with, first and foremost, France. You know, I think the sort of picture at the last NATO summit between French President Macron and President Erdogan speaks volumes in this respect. So I think there's a change of paradigm that we're living through that, because, as I said, of a higher order issue there, it automatically changes conditions. And then I think, sort of having said all this, I think it's also fair to say that different countries in the region are reacting really quite differently. I mean, it was, you know, striking for me, for instance, a couple of weeks ago in Qatar to see the way in which Qatar has sided very openly. I mean, it knows on which side it stands in a way in which other countries in the Gulf have not. I mean, it's a very different story if you're talking about the UAE. It's another story if you're talking about Saudi Arabia. Interestingly, you know, two countries that have had, again, tense relations in the recent past, like Israel and Turkey, are in many respects actually positioning themselves in similar ways. So I think, you know, and I'll stop here for this first question, I've already spoken far too much. I think, you know, because we are talking about such a systemic change, it is both cutting across cleavages and perhaps creating new ones.
Mm-hmm. Manuel, do you want to comment on what Nathalie just said?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, as it was said repeatedly here, this is quite a shock. I mean, the war in the Ukraine and has brought the big question marks, but also some clarity to our thinking of these developments. But I want to insist on one particular point. I think that independently of the war in Ukraine, we are witnessing a resurgence of the southern part of Europe and the Mediterranean in general. I mean, you know, history has been kind of, in many ways, dictated by the northern part of the hemisphere, okay? And the dominant countries, the dominant powers have been in the north. And now we are witnessing a resurgence. We are no longer the backyard, we meaning the wider Mediterranean. Nathalie, you come from Italy. Italy is now, the Prime Minister is one of the key European figures that essentially play a key role in saving the economy of Europe, you know, Mario Draghi, okay? Greece is experiencing tremendous economic growth, both in 2021 and projected to 2022, okay? More than many other countries in the region after suffering an economic collapse, okay? In my view, this is very good news, obviously for the two countries, but for the region, okay? And one of the lessons from the war in the Ukraine is that small and mid-sized countries need to bunch together, okay, in order to both strengthen themselves mutually and confront external threats and challenges. And, you know, the session before this one was on the Balkans. Think of that, on the Western Balkans, but, you know, think of the Balkans. You know, it used to be one country, right? Yugoslavia and so forth. And now there are, if I'm not mistaken, 9 countries, okay? I may be mistaken in the number, you know, but more or less there, okay? Small, medium-sized countries. What about them? They need, and they are doing that. They are sort of aligning themselves. There is a new awareness of the need for regional alignments, not cutting across, you know, the traditional ways, not cutting across according to your to the great powers dictate. Okay, and these are very good news.
Okay, I keep the good news. Let's shift the discussion a little bit on Libya, because Libya was creating headline news until late 2021, and suddenly we all took our eyes away from Libya, and I'm a little worried about when we'll put our eyes back to Libya. Things in the country are extremely fragile. No one is seeing any breakthrough in the withdrawal of foreign troops and the realization of free elections. And what should we expect from now on? Because Italy is also affected and very much interested in developments. And how is it affecting this whole evolutions in Libya, the Eastern Mediterranean? Nathalie, I'm starting from you.
Yeah, I mean, I think sort of, well, let's say, what was the situation like before the Ukraine war, and what does the Ukraine war tell us about Libya moving forward? I mean, I think sort of pre-war, we were in a situation whereby essentially, as is often the case, the creation of a balance of forces on the ground, which essentially took place with Turkey's intervention, it created a balance with Russia, and that led to the conditions of a ceasefire. But as we also know, a ceasefire can either lead to peace building, or it can essentially lead to a more or less simmering conflict, which can then break out. You know, one only needs to think about Nagorno-Karabakh to realize that, you know, at times a ceasefire can last a couple of decades. But then, unless the conditions for peace building are established, that simply doesn't happen. And of course, it was not the case in Libya. And it was not the case in Libya, and I think in all fairness, also because beyond the diplomatic involvement, which I think did take place at European level, but there was not much else. There was not much European, I would say, cohesive security involvement, essentially, in Libya. So we could talk as much as we liked about, how important it was for foreign forces to leave, but, I mean, it was talk. Yeah. And to simply expect whatever, the Berlin process, the Berlin conference to actually deliver on this was, frankly speaking, pie in the sky. Now, then you get to a situation in which you have the war in Ukraine, and I think it's really quite interesting to sort of try and think through how does all this change the picture. And I think you could see things going in not too direct, I guess there are sort of two opposite signals, and I think both of which are probably going to play out. I think the first, and obviously they both have to do with Russia, right? Now, the first has to do with the fact that Russia is obviously preoccupied elsewhere, and it will increasingly need forces, including Wagner, that we know, of course, is present in Libya, and you could make the similar argument about Mali. So on the one hand, you could imagine that Russia will have less capacity moving forward to remain involved as much as it has been in Libya or in sub-Saharan Africa more broadly. And that obviously sort of goes, so you could see trends moving in one direction. At the same time, you could imagine that actually Russia's willingness to spoil increases tremendously. I've been having quite a few energy conversations in Italy. And of course, Libya comes up in the whole broader debate about energy diversification, which of course now is front and center. And let me be very frank, Libya is not exactly a place that one is counting on at the moment, precisely because the calculation is one that the instability, the insecurity in Libya, driven by Russia, is actually going to increase. So you can see things actually going in both directions. I would say in the immediate term, probably things getting even more complicated. Perhaps sort of moving forward, given that unfortunately I don't think that this, the war in Ukraine is going to end anytime soon, Russia's capacity to keep up, even if its will is there, its capacity to keep up that spoiling potential may actually reduce in future.
Manuel, you want to say a few words about Libya?
And I say that I agree with Nathalie. But let me pick on some points that you mentioned. You mentioned bypassing Wagner, the Wagner group. I've been in this conference for 2 days, and the Wagner group was not mentioned very often. And it's time to put it on the table. The Wagner group is a mercenary force, fully backed and trained by Russia, that has been playing a role in Syria, in the bloodiest battles in Syria, in various places in Africa, and of course in Libya. And we know it's something that kind of we forgot about it until they show up big time in the Ukraine. They were in the Ukraine before, in Donbass. They play a very significant role, but we were not paying attention to it. And people were asking, what is this? Think of it. A mercenary force, fully trained and supported by Russia, okay, playing such a role. And we were looking the other way, okay? So this is a reminder of that. This is a reminder that we the world, the Western world, certainly in NATO, the EU, cannot allow that to happen. What, they have to get to the point of Ukraine and the heart of Europe to realize how abnormal and devastating such a behavior can be. So regarding Libya, to the point, I'm typically optimistic, and I tend to see the bright side of the moon, not in the case of Libya. There are no, I can't see how this conflict will reach a point where it can, reach what is called the zone of agreement. I cannot see it happening Okay, I can see absolutely that maybe Russian involvement will decrease in the Wagner force because it's distracted by Ukraine. But in order for it in order for a significant change to happen, then the EU has to take a much more active role.
More initiative.
I mean, you just cannot, Italy has been on the receiving side of the conflict because of the geographic proximity and, the refugees and so forth and so on. Imagine a different reality. Imagine that, there is a much more forceful intervention of the EU in Libya, and then consider the distance from Libya to Sicily to Italy in terms of the energy potential of that, okay? And the flow of resources to Libya to reconstruct, and so forth and so on. This could be a completely different reality. Mm-hmm. But you cannot sit back, okay, and look the other way. So in that sense, I hope that the war in the Ukraine will have a positive effect, but it takes its time, and so I'm not too optimistic about it.
Okay, let's wait and see. Let's shift the discussion on Turkey. There is a country that has upgraded its geopolitical role during the Ukrainian crisis. Is that a development that the rest of the countries in the East Med should welcome or should be intimidated by it? I'll start with Manuel, your turn.
So, I tend to think that when you engage a country that has been in a conflictual relationship with its neighbors or other countries, when you engage in a dialogue, that's a positive development for the most part. And I think that may be the case. But I'm sort of skeptical for the following reason. Putin has been in power for over 23 years, if I'm not mistaken, if you take...
1999, yes.
Yes, so 23 years or so. President Erdogan has been in power in various guises, okay, for a bit less. But it's on the order...
Less,
yeah, 3 years
approximately
less. So
same,
it's,
yes.
2 decades. There is something very systematic about leaders being in power for too long. I always tell my students, the U.S. passed an amendment to its constitution limiting
on
the terms to 2 terms. When did the U.S. do that? After
the Second World War?
Yes, and who was the most successful president the U.S. had?
Roosevelt.
Franklin Delano Roosevelt, okay? 4 times elected to the presidency, okay? The most successful president, one of the most successful, okay?
True.
And nevertheless, they said, nope, these times we were lucky,
right.
He was very successful, we cannot allow that, okay? So what I'm trying to say is that Turkey is governed by a president that has been too long in power. It has gravitated towards autocracy, even though the system remains nominally, and in the mechanics of it, perhaps, a democracy. And so, although I relate to the news about the dialogue that we're having now, Israel and Turkey, as a positive development, as I said, I don't trust that will be a long-lasting development.
Nathalie, your comments?
Yeah, well, I agree with Manuel on the internal sort of Turkish domestic political situation. I mean, I feel quite strongly that up until when Erdogan will remain in power, one can manage the relationship with Turkey, and I think it's crucially important to do so because Erdogan will not always be in power. But it's very difficult to really imagine how there can be a real sort of strategic shift in the relationship with Turkey. Now, moving though on to the sort of the other side of I think your question, how is this war? Is it changing Turkey's geopolitical standing, geopolitical position? And I've got two comments to that. I mean, the first is, yes, it's obviously true that Turkey has been incredibly active in terms of its diplomacy. But I think it's important to highlight that the reason why it has done so has, in my personal view, less to do with Turkish strength and more to do with Turkish, I would say weakness is the wrong word, but the way in which Turkey is just so exposed to the consequences of this war that it needs to have, more than perhaps many other countries in the region. I'd be, also very interested to hear the Israeli kind of side of things. But Turkey is and has been over the last years, increasingly pushed in a sense into Russian arms. It's now in a situation whereby, economically, energetically, in security terms, it cannot afford to have a break with Russia. But at the same time, it has a close relationship with Ukraine and it sees what's happening. Yeah. So in a sense, Turkey, really needs to believe that these negotiations are going to go somewhere. So in this respect, I see it more as a consequence of its own, in a sense, strategic fragility rather than as a source of strength. Now, is the fact that, after years in which Turkey had been increasingly pushed in Russia's lap, in my view, I think we made many mistakes in that respect. I didn't think we did ourselves any favours. Not that Turkey did not do its bit, but I think that strategically we made a series of mistakes in the sense of pushing Turkey into Russia's lap. Now that Turkey,
when you say you mean NATO?
Europe, the European Union, etc. Now that I think Turkey is far more open and disposed to kind of rethink, not in a deep way up until when I think Erdogan will remain in power, but at least on perhaps a more superficial but nonetheless important level, sort of rethink its relationship with NATO, with the European Union. I think that is an opportunity that we should seize. And I think this connects to the comment that I was making to your first question, in the sense that it also has implications on the Greek-Turkish relationship.
True. Okay, now let me pan the discussion to an issue that is very hot these days. It has to do with the East Med pipeline. Now, Victoria Nuland, the Undersecretary of the United States, came to Greece a couple of days ago. Then she went to Cyprus, and now she's in Berlin, I guess. She gave an interview to Kathimerini newspaper yesterday, and she said, we've got to use LNG, and we've got to use electricity connections that we can do more quickly, while also calling for the transfer of natural gas via LNG and the participation of Turkey in cooperation with Greece, Israel, Egypt, and the other countries. Now, there are two questions here. Is the East Med pipeline out of the question? And the second question is, can we do this swiftly and smoothly in the neighborhood? Whoever wants to pick the question first, sure.
Go ahead.
Go ahead. You're,
Right. So, again, things have changed so much. I mean, you look at the Eastern Mediterranean, okay, and over the decade, it has become a net exporter of gas. I mean, this is something that, we couldn't dream, back then. And by the way, there are vast deposits and reserves of gas that are still untapped. And so, Cyprus can be a big player, and Israel is already a significant player, and Egypt, okay? And there's Turkey is trying to get its hand in waters that are not strictly and in their territorial waters, but nevertheless. So clearly the potential is there for there to be an alternative source of gas to Europe, that in the transition to green energy, okay, gas plays and will play an increasingly important role. Because when you look at the possibilities, okay, so, oil is out, coal is out, oil is not out, but I'm saying in terms of our thinking, okay, of hydrocarbon energy, and sun and wind takes its time, to become sufficiently available and cheap, and be able to solve all the problems with the smart grid and so forth and so on. So gas is an intermediate phase in this transition. It happens to be in the Eastern Mediterranean in vast quantities. And so the remaining question is one of logistics, okay, and of geopolitics. The logistical question can be solved. You know, I sort of know some of it. I'm not an expert. Yes, there are serious problems with the feasibility of the pipeline, but they can be solved. And there are some alternatives which are very interesting. So I think that both, I mean, what the Undersecretary said is true, that in the short run, kind of, you know, connectivity with the grids is a partial solution. You cannot expect it to provide for much. You need a much bigger and smarter infrastructure for that to happen. But it's a liquefied gas, yes, I mean, it's something that can be provided quickly and so forth, and you need that. By the way, you know, we entered the spring, summer, it's a period of decreased demand for gas in Europe, particularly in Germany, but you know, as in the series, you know, the Games of Thrones, you know, the sentence, winter is coming. At some point we were saying winter is coming, and therefore the need for a reliable supply of energy will come back. So we need to provide for a bunch array of solutions. Again, the Eastern Mediterranean can be a source. It is already doing it. We can expand on that. We shouldn't rule out any of the technological options. They have to be on the table. And again, the EU will have to play a role much more than the US.
Yes.
The US is not part of the region, okay? And the US should step forward and say, yes, we are going to deploy our resources to make it happen.
Somebody said a couple of hours ago that the EU keeps on reinventing itself after a huge crisis. So let's hope that's the case this time again.
Yes.
Natalie, we're only left with 2 minutes, so your floor is yours for a concluding remark.
Yeah, I really wanted to pick on this energy piece. I mean, I think it's important to underline the fact that the reason why the East Med, in energy terms, had kind of disappeared from the discussion.
The pipeline.
Not only the pipeline, not only the pipeline. I mean, the remaining East Med gas story was basically an Egyptian-Israeli story that was an LNG story that was not connected to European energy security because we thought up until not 2 months ago, 6 months ago, that energy security was a thing of the past.
Right.
Now energy security is back.
Here it is.
So East Med is back.
Okay.
Now then the question is, which connects to the East Med pipeline aspect, does this mean just LNG or also pipeline?
Okay.
My personal view is that you can actually walk and chew gum at the same time, but I think that so I think LNG will be, you know, sort of whether it's Egyptian, whether it's Israeli through Egypt. Will be an important part of the story. I do think that the East Med pipeline has a potential future, although I also think that in order for it to have a potential future, a way has to be found also to create a branch through to Turkey.
It makes sense. Thank you very much, both you, Nathalie, and Professor Manuel Trajtenberg, for being here at Delphi. Hope to see you also next year. And I pass the floor to Konstantinos Filis, if I'm not mistaken, who is going to moderate the next panel. Thank you very much for being here with us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.